maybe three or 4 miles south of Frametown, and I can actually tell you why in a little bit if you're curious.
I
Um,
am.
but I will tell you his account, which was like I said, it was nighttime. Um, his wife and his child were both sleeping in the car, and as he's driving along Route 4, he starts having engine problems and electrical problems with his vehicle. So he stopped along the road just to, sort of check it out, lift up the hood, see if he could see anything wrong. And while he was examining his car, he noticed like a bright white light behind him that, caused him to turn and kind of try to investigate, see what was going on, maybe walk toward it. And as he turns back around to look at his car, his wife had woken up at this point and noticed a figure behind him in the light
Oh,
and
my.
screamed at him and told him, there's something behind you. So he sees it and turns and gets back in the car and grabs his wife and his kid, puts them in the back of the car, shuts the doors, locks them, and lays on top of them to try to protect them. And they lay there for just, what I imagine were only moments, but probably felt like an eternity.
Well, you know it did. That would be terrifying.
Yeah. So by the time, he has the guts to sort of lift up and look around, there's nothing around the car. There's no more light. There's no figure, nothing. So everybody gets back in their seats. He gets back in his car, turns on the car, which his car problems seem to vanish, and head back on his way. And then later, he said maybe the next day, whenever it was light, he noticed that there was a strange, what he could only describe as a handprint that looked like it was almost like burned into the finish of his hood that had 3 fingers. Exactly
Oh,
what it
my.
was, or if it was a handprint, he didn't know. But in his mind, he thought this was left by whatever that was touching my car, and maybe the skin or whatever was on it reacting to the paint and causing that impression.
I have a question
So,
at this point, if you don't mind,
yes.
because I
No, please.
understand that this was a completely different era. There were no cell phones, there were no
Right.
instamatic cameras yet. There
Right.
were very few ways that you would be able to document this other than word of mouth and journaling.
Hmm.
So, but there were like press photographers and, portrait photographers and stuff. Was there anything that he did to try to document that handprint?
There's nothing that I know of. I found that original article that was in that magazine, but no pictures accompanied the article. And I know that while he was still living, George was, people reached out to George on several occasions to try to get his story or to try to interview him further. And the way that I understand it, all his response was always, I said everything that I know and that I can tell you for sure, or even that I could guess in that article, and I don't have anything else to say. So he was never interested in being interviewed again or, anything like that.
Well, that wouldn't happen today, would it?
Yeah, well, yeah, you wouldn't think so.
Not often. Not often.
Yeah, yeah. So, he shied away from any sort of extra attention, and has since passed away. And I'll tell you though why. See, the reason why it was initially thought that it happened in Frametown was because, based on previous investigators talking to him and coming to the area, that's just sort of a good guess that they came up with. But I'll tell you why I think it happened in Strange Creek, which is just slightly south. It's close to the border between Braxton County and Clay County, and that is because, now this story is gonna freak you out, and I'm still not sure where I land on it, but it's an incredible story nonetheless. There is a gentleman that I got to speak to not too long ago who's elderly now. He's actually the younger brother of a woman that I go to church with, and I was talking to this lady that I go to church with, and because everybody knows me around here. I'm the guy that works at the Flatwoods Monster Museum, and she said, you should talk to my brother because he thinks he saw something at our house in Strange Creek. So I was like, get out of town. Can I have his phone number? so
and I'll
she
call
gave me his
him
phone
now.
number.
Yes.
Yeah. So I called him, and now he did wish, he wishes to completely remain, unnamed, anonymous. Is not interested in going on record in any sort, but his story is still incredibly compelling and one that I am incredibly fascinated by, and that is because they grew up in this county, so they grew up knowing about the Flatwoods Monster. They knew, they heard all the stories and everything, and actually he didn't really think of it anything more than just this local legend, and really didn't give it a whole lot of mind. Well, you may be familiar with Frank Ficino's book.
Yes.
That I can't remember when it came out, but soon after it came out, this gentleman bought his book and was reading it just because, he's interested in local history and that sort of thing. And while he's reading the book, it gets to the section about about that incident, about the Snitowski incident, and so he's reading it. He's like, "Wow, I can't believe this happened, so close to where I live." Again, nothing registering, nothing ringing a bell. But he gets to the page where there's an illustration that Frank did based off of George's, George's details that he gave. And he said instantly, as soon as he saw that photo, he just had this flashback in his head, something just click in his head, and a memory from nowhere come to the forefront of his consciousness, and he was just, paralyzed with what he was thinking about, and it hit him that he thinks he saw this thing that Frank drew, and he said, doing the math, he said, I there's no way that I could have been older than 3 at the time. He said, but I think I saw this thing standing or walking through our property out my bedroom window whenever I was 3 in the middle of the night. So I was like, that's incredible.
So it was like a repressed childhood memory.
Yeah.
Wow.
So he said, okay, so this is what happened. He said, I wake up in the middle of the night and it's dark. And I just happen to, it's like I walk out of my bedroom, walk into the hallway. Everybody is asleep. Everybody's in their rooms. All the doors are shut. So I go back to bed. And as I go back to bed, I glance out my window and I see this thing that's huge and going through our property. And I'm immediately scared. So I want to go out and tell somebody, but everybody's asleep. So instead of waking anybody up, he just goes back to his room, looks out the window again. It's not there anymore. So he just goes to sleep. So then, once he's sort of recalled this memory, and he's wondering, like, am I somehow making this up? Is it, am I actually remembering a real thing that I remember? So he goes up to his oldest sister and says, I have to tell you something. You might think I'm crazy, but, I have to tell you this. So he tells her this story, and she says, you want to know what? He said, around that time, you would go around talking about seeing a monster in our yard, and we just assumed you had a nightmare about it and didn't even pay any mind.
Oh, wow.
She said, but you talked about seeing a monster in our yard all the time, and that he doesn't remember. He doesn't remember talking about it. So that, and for me, and talking to this gentleman, and me knowing the family connections and everything, it's a credible witness enough for me. This is all just memory, and I know that memories are fallible, and memories kind of change every time you think of them again. But that has always just hit me as feeling pretty, pretty reliable and something to really, cement, and even to help cement George Snitowski's story.
Well, it does. It's in the same time frame, right?
Yeah, it would have been Like I said, he can't remember exactly when it would have taken place because he was so young. Dates and all that aren't going to stick with him, but he knows that that's about the time period that he would have had his experience. So, to me, it makes sense.
Well, it makes sense from this side too. I just, people, especially with family remembering him discussing that.
Yeah.
When I always trust children, pretty much trust dogs, and
yeah,
with no qualms.
Right.
And especially witnesses who do not care for the limelight. People who just, this just happened. There are some very famous abductee cases that the people were kind of outed because the circumstances surrounding their disappearance were so well documented that they kind of have to talk about that. But This is different from that, right? This is absolutely people not being all about drawing attention to themselves. They're trying to actually avoid that.
Yeah, so. and I get the feeling whenever I was talking to this gentleman on the phone that had he not known who I was and known that I had this connection to his family, he probably would have had no interest in talking to me.
Absolutely. That's what it sounds like to me, too.
Yeah.
Well, when his sister came back and said, well, of course, we remember when you were doing this, did he feel validated? Did it help him?
Well, see, that's the thing. It's kind of funny. Like I said, one of his sisters I know really well, and she would have been younger at the time, and she doesn't have those recollections like her older sister does. But she one thing she always says, my brother is one of the most honest, people I've ever known, but I just can't get over him remembering something from being 3. That just doesn't make any sense to me. So, and even he will tell you, it hit him like a ton of bricks, but at the same time, he can't be completely sure. It's just the best he can come up with, right now or at the time. So, I think he probably feels validated in it, but at the same time, I'm sure there's many more questions than answers.
Oh, there would have to be. Good heavens. That being said, we're up on our second break already. This time is flying, Andrew. It seems
you said
to
it
happen.
Would.
I did, and it just seems to always amaze me that it does. But this is a 2-minute interlude. This is a piece of music called Transmission, and we do get our music from Purple Planet Music, and we sure do appreciate them. So we will be back in 2 minutes. Y'all just enjoy this.
to WP